Thank you. So follow that. That's what I was thinking. How many of you were here for last week's presentation by David Batista? Great, fantastic. So David made a really interesting case for understanding the climate science, and he was looking at things like food security and some of the implications, but very much from the perspective of a climatologist in terms of the physical climate system processes that it's very important to understand as a baseline in addressing these types of issues. I'm going to try and take that debate a little bit further by looking at a sort of broader range of land resource impacts, but looking specifically at how individuals and society may be able to adapt to some of those impacts. So it's trying to put the people back into the climate change problem. Before I start, though, I'd very much like to highlight for you that this talk is given by myself and colleagues. Those colleagues are too numerous to mention. I'll try and acknowledge some of them as I go through this presentation, but there are many people who I've had the opportunity to work with who've made numerous contributions that you'll see this evening. Okay, so let's just look at where we are currently. This is recent data which has been produced by UNEP, published in 2013, which is called the UNEP gap analysis. So in a way, this is setting out the case for where we are. And I realise you won't be able to see all of what's on this graphics, but I can just highlight one or two things for you. What we've got here on the y-axis is the annual global total of greenhouse gases emitted, okay, from human society and their activities. We have a line here which shows the business as usual continuation of our emissions into the future up to the year 2020. It's not entirely clear. But what we have here are a number of other curves that represent the pledges that various governments made following the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties meeting that you probably, or conference, that you probably read about in your newspapers and heard about in the news. And this shows the reduction in the business as usual emissions profile if different levels of those pledges are implemented. So this is like the best case scenario, so all the pledges are implemented, and this is a sort of less ambitious set of goals. Now what we have down at the bottom here is the projected range up to 2020, which gives the range of uncertainty from a whole range of different emissions assumptions, climate models, etc., about the way the future climate is going with different levels of climate change. And this is the median 2-degree centigrade rise range, which is considered to be indicative of the level of dangerous climate change that's commonly used in policy spheres. And what you'll see is, so this is the level of greenhouse gases we have to get to within this range to achieve 2 degrees centigrade rise. What you can see is the pledges from governments are up here, even the best case scenario. So what we have is what's called the remaining gap in terms of emissions globally of greenhouse gases. So this is even with the current will of international governments, we're still a long way short of getting it down even to the 2 degrees dangerous climate change. So basically, the point about this is we're already committed to climate change. There's no doubt about that. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Unless there's an enormous shift in attitudes at a governmental level, then we have to accept that we're going to deal with climate change, right? No two ways about it. And as a consequence, I think what you tend to find in climate change research at present is a shift away from an emphasis on trying to mitigate the problem, because we know we can no longer mitigate all of the problem, to thinking about how we're going to adapt to climate change in the future. And this talk is really trying to focus on some of those adaptation issues. Okay, so where are we going? Knowing that climate change is going to happen, what are going to be the consequences? Is it going to be that? Possibly. Actually, I don't think so. Right? There are lots of challenges, but I don't think we've got to the point of the extinction of our species. But we do need to think about how we can analyse and address the consequences of future climate change and what we can do to respond to it. We don't have a crystal ball, but we're trying to deal with things that are highly uncertain that will happen into the future. So how can we assess the likely consequences of climate change with available tools and methods? Okay, the future has one real problem, that is we can't observe it. We can't observe it because it hasn't happened yet. We know, though, that the future will be very different than it is today. So we need a set of tools, a way of analysing the future, which is quite different than the traditional set of empirically based research methods. The way we typically, therefore, would go about trying to understand the impact of climate change in the future is first of all to build a model of how the world works, or usually some component of that, and we would also force that model with scenarios which are projections of an alternative range of developments in the climate system, in socio-economic development pathways, etc. And we use that virtual experimentation environment, usually through mathematical modelling in most cases, to try to understand what the future might be what might look like. So typically, we might do something like this. So I thought when I was putting this talk together that what the good people of Edinburgh really wanted to hear about is hairy greenweed. So here's your opportunity. I'm sure you've all been thinking long and hard about this, but this is actually just an example of a typical way in which people look at climate change impacts, how they do assessments. And David last week showed several examples of this. So you have a model. In this case, it's called a bioclimatic model. It looks at the climatic limits to the distribution of a particular species. You create some sort of emulator, in this case it's a neural network, to look at how you can simulate those spatial patterns. And you get a simulation which you train based on the observational data or the distribution of that species. So that includes the climate limits. So then as the climate shifts, so in this case you get a warming moving northwards because we're in Europe, you can explore with different scenarios of climate change, different climate models, different emission scenarios, different periods of time, 2020, 2050, 2080, how that distribution will change. So in this case, things aren't looking so good for hairy greenweed, which you might be disappointed to hear, pretty little flowers. So the total climate space reduces quite significantly. Okay? Actually, though, what I should also point out about this simulation is it's not quite so bad in the UK. Okay? Because of this northward expansion under the current distribution, there's very little in the UK, but you do get some benefits. So there are winners and losers in these types of assessments. But it's a very simple simulation. Next example. Another variable. I want to look at, I'm focusing on Europe again, changes in soil organic carbon content. Right? Very important for a number of reasons, not least soil fertility, but also carbon sequestration for climate mitigation. Okay, slightly fuzzy maps. You don't have to see all the details because I'm going to tell you. These are maps of soil, of changes in soil carbon content due to climate change. And basically the legend is where you see blue colours, that means you get an increase in soil carbon. Where you see red colours, you get a decrease in soil carbon. And that's largely because you have warmer temperatures, increased soil respiration and emission of carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's fine. But, so what you're seeing from this is the impact of climate change is quite disastrous for soil carbon. That's not very good at all. Think of all the implications for soil fertility of losing that much soil carbon into the atmosphere. But that's looking at climate alone. I've got a different set of maps, those on the right, which you can see straight away looks infinitely better because they're almost all blue. What's the difference between the two? The right-hand map incorporates, as well as looking at the effects of climate change, it also looks at the effects of land use change, a different driver that affects soil organic carbon content. In these maps, the top one actually, the top two are cropland and the bottom two are grassland. They show different types of land use. So in this particular example, you actually get quite a big decline in the areas of cropland, which means that you have vegetation replacing cropland, which sequesters more carbon. So if you look at the climate question alone, you get a completely different outcome and what is probably a completely misleading outcome than if you look at multiple drivers. So one of the first important messages I'm trying to convey here is that you do need to think about these multiple drivers, not climate change in isolation. So the example I just showed you was based on simulation of land use change. And I want to raise some other points by showing you this. So this is a work published a few years ago now in Science, which looked at trying to model the response of cropland distributions in Europe, or the EU15 at that time, to climate change. So in this case, we're looking at a particular climate model in the 2080s into the future. I think that, is this still going? What you can basically see, again, if you focus on this legend, you'll see that all of these values are actually negative. So the cropland areas under these different emission scenarios, these are the IPCC SRES scenarios for those who are familiar with that, these give different levels of climate change. Under those different levels of climate change and different assumptions about socio-economic change, you always have a decline in cropland areas all over. And that's because of some assumptions that were made about increases in technology and about the effects of carbon dioxide on plant production, which actually means that productivity, because of those factors, increases in the future. Nothing to do with climate change. Climate change has a small negative effect, but actually the other effects are more important. So what we're seeing is things like assumptions about technological development, assumptions about changes in economic demand for different agricultural commodities are the types of drivers and effects which are overriding the effect of climate change in this example. I'm not saying that climate change is not important, but in this case we need a balance to think about this. Okay, technological change. How do we know how technology will change over the next 50 to 100 years? We don't. It's incredibly uncertain. It's very, very difficult to anticipate what crop breeders or GMO specialists are going to be doing over that time horizon to actually allow us to respond in appropriate ways to the problem of climate change. It's just not certain. So this is the type of issues that we're trying to grapple with here. So again, the point being there are multiple drivers, and the important multiple drivers are those that are mediated by human influence in some form or other, in this case technological development or economics. And we can look at how that actually pans out as well. So this is just some observational data. What you can see is actually the long-term trend in area of European cereals, this is for actually, is a decline. So actually our future projections are not inconsistent with what's happened in the past in Europe. And again, that's largely because if you look at this one here, the green curve, you've had a major increase in crop yields for cereals, up to about 2.5 times since the 1960s. So this is what David Batista was talking about in terms of the agricultural revolution, the green revolution, but that's continued onwards. Incidentally, I have had, when I was involved in the IPCC process, a big argument with some of my colleagues about what was perceived as being a levelling off of that increase in crop yield. So you see here it's more or less linear for this part up until about, well, the 1990s, and then it appears to level off. We had a big argument, because many of my colleagues argue it's a signal of climate change. We know the climate is already 0.5 degree warmer than it was 50 or 60 years ago, and what we're seeing is a decline in yields because of that. It's the climate change signal. But then I pointed out this graph, this curve, which is fertilizer use. And those of you who don't have to be agronomists to know that nitrogen fertilizer is quite important for growing crops. They're very sensitive to that. And actually there's been a massive decrease. If you look at that, this is all rebased, so 2 to 1. Fertilizer use over that same period of time has halved. It's remarkable, indeed, that crop yields are continuing to increase. So there are other factors that are going on in terms of improvement of management, technological development, which means we can produce more for lower inputs. Okay? So this reduction is to do with things like regulation, protected areas, regulating total limits of fertilizer applications. So we need to think about these other things. We cannot look at this climate change question in isolation. I'm actually just going to skip on from that one and get onto some other things, actually. Yeah, okay. So the next main point, I may come back to those later. So we looked at multiple drivers, considered socioeconomics as well as climate change, and the next message I want to try and get across is how we think about impacts across sectors. So traditionally in impact assessment, you would be a health specialist and you would look at the effects of climate change on respiratory diseases, or you'd be an agricultural specialist, you look at crop yields, forests, you look at crop biomass productivity. But actually, in practice, we know that many of those sectors are interrelated, they're interconnected. Okay? There's competition for land between urban and agriculture, there's competition for water between residential uses, industrial uses, and ecological uses. And there are knock-on effects. Agriculture has an enormous effect on biodiversity and species distributions. So we can't really start thinking about how do we address this climate change problem until we begin to understand some of those relationships, and that's really crucial. And I'm going to show you just a quick exercise that we've been working with at the moment, where we're trying to build what are called integrated assessment models at the regional scale, which try to simulate through mathematical formulations how individual sectors perform and behave, and how climate change would impact them, and how those sectors interact with one another. So have these individual sort of models looking at hydrology or urbanization or crop yield development or forestry, and these arrows represent a whole range of flows of information between those different sectors. So we can start to simulate these things. And we could do this at a European scale. Okay? So we've been modeling that sort of wall-to-wall pan-European analyses based on these integrated cross-sectoral models. And this is the type of thing that come out. And this is why I want to demonstrate an important point. I realize this looks a bit complex, but I'll just try and take you through it. What we've got here, I'm just showing you two indicators which are output from this model. The water exploitation index on the left is actually a way of representing the appropriation of water by people. So if you have a value of 0 on the y-axis here, that means that people don't use any of the available water resource. A value of 1 on this axis means that people use 100% of the available resource. Beyond 1, and you've overexploited the available resource. Okay? The indicator on the right, irrigation, that's just irrigation usage, fairly straightforward to understand. Now what this graphic did, what we did is within this integrated system, we tried to understand how important was the interaction between sectors compared to the direct impact of climate change on a given sector. So we could run our models as sector standalone models, so you'd only run it for agriculture, you'd only run it for water resources, etc. And you could run the whole coupled system with lots of interrelationships. And you could compare the difference. You take one away from the other. And that's actually what the curve shows. So where you've got, let's look at this curve. It's also divided by different parts of Europe. This shows a distribution. So the model simulates each point on a grid over the whole of Europe, and you can create a distribution of the differences between the multiple sectors and the single sectors. And that gives you these types of curves. So what if you have a look at this red curve, it's the easiest to see. It's the southern region, so the Mediterranean, Europe. If it's a positive value between 0 and 1, that's where the integrated assessment model, the integrated coupling, gives you a higher value than the standalone, and vice versa where you have negative values. Now what you can see immediately, particularly for areas which are prone to drought, such as the southern region, is that there are no cases where the two models agree, or probably only 1 or 2 at that point there. And in most cases, the difference between a single assessment and a multiple assessment means that one either largely over or underestimates the impact without cross-sectoral interaction. Right? So what we're getting is a very, very different answer. So when we look at all these impact studies that are looking at just agriculture or just at hydrology, if they're not considering the interaction effects between those different sectors, they're really going to over or underestimate the effects of climate change. So that's a really important message I want to try and get across as well. For irrigation, it's less important because you've got this, well, it's still significant, but you've got this area where actually the two models agree. So it's not, it seems to be less of a problem for that indicator. Okay? So, a few interim conclusions just to try and reiterate some of these messages. Climate change is going to happen, so we need to understand impacts, okay, and how to adapt to these. The second one, we need to move beyond assessments that are only single drivers, only looking at climate change, and we need to look at a range of drivers that capture interaction effects. So other socio-economic change effect drivers are equally important within the environmental change debate. We need to look at alternative future socio-economic development pathways because they are really important in understanding, even primarily, the impact of climate change. And we need to understand interactions across sectors because some of those cross-sectoral interactions can be as large as the direct impacts of climate change on a single sector. Right? So, it's complex. Yeah? Don't worry, I'll try and look at the complexity and uncertainty issues a bit later. Anyway, as a consequence, we need to think about how we can adapt to these types of impacts, and that's what I want to move on to as the next stage. Right, so I just want to give you some examples of how, different examples of how people think about adaptation. How do you understand how society will adapt to climate change in 50 years' time? Right? That's a major intellectual challenge to try and achieve. Well, one of the initial ways that people started thinking about this was, can we look at society and think about the adaptive capacity of that society? What is the capacity of our society to deal with climate change? And you can break that down. You can work backwards on this diagram. You can think about the components that add up to that: awareness, ability, and action. You can think about the determinants of those components: equality, knowledge, technology, etc. And you can get right back to individual indicators: activity rate, income inequality, literacy rate, which you can use as proxies through this type of linked system to understand how different societies might be adaptive to climate change. It's very much a top-down indicator-based approach, but you can do things like this. You can then create an index based and rescaled on a 0 to 1 scale, where 0 is very poor adaptive capacity and 1 is very high. And you can look at mapping that because we have socioeconomic indicators across the European territory for the units that are shown on these maps. So it's a very generic sense, but it gives us some idea of how these societies may adapt to climate change. Important point to take with this, or the two. First of all, you could see that adaptive capacity is very variable geographically. Okay? So that means that the same impact of climate change in one location would have very different consequences than the same impact, identical impact, in another location, because of the capacity of societies in those two different locations to deal with the types of problems they're faced with. Okay? Some societies may be able to deal with it, others not. The other point is these are just two quite similar sort of baselines for different data that were used for this system, and actually you can probably see that there are already differences between those two time steps. So as well as being variable in space, it changes through time. And logically, we can think about taking that forward into time. So let's think about scenarios of how society may evolve through into the future. Okay? So here's an example based again on the SRES scenario. So this is just one set of socioeconomic assumptions. And again, what you see, this is 2020, 2050, 2080, a projection based on this simple model, looking at changing those input indicators. And again, you get a change in the distribution of the adaptive capacity. So what that means is that an impact to climate change that happens in 2050 will have different consequences than an impact to climate change in 2080, simply because society has moved, well, one would hope positively, but it could also be in a negative direction, in a way that makes it better able to cope with these types of problems. Okay? So we cannot just think the effect of climate change in 80 years' time, we're going to be adaptive in the way that we are now. The world will be different in 80 years' time in some way or other. So we need to think about the response in 80 years' time, not the response immediately now. And again, we can look at a whole range of different scenarios. Again, the same idea. These are different SRES scenarios, which again give you different patterns of adaptive capacity. So our visions of how we think society will evolve into the future will have a strong fundamental bearing on how those societies will adapt to climate change. That's a bit fuzzy, so I'll move on from that. Well, actually, no, I won't. It's fuzzy anyway. This is just to take onto the sort of final step of this process. So I've introduced you to the notion of adaptive capacity, but you can also look at the impact of climate change. And traditionally, when we combine the notion of whether you can adapt and when you can have an impact together, it's what we term vulnerability, so vulnerability to climate change. So in this case, this is looking at the vulnerability of farmer livelihoods, so the vulnerability of farmers. So it's using the land use change information that I was showing you earlier. It's looking at the impact of climate change. And it's quite difficult to represent this, and I know the maps are a bit fuzzy, but what we've got here is an axis which looks at the potential impact, sensitivity of the system, the exposure, i.e. the level of climate change, and something which looks at the adaptive capacity, which is, so you've got the saturation in one direction, and you've got the red to green in the other direction. Red is bad, deep red is even worse. And again, what you'll see is then this distribution on the map of where you have vulnerability is a function of both the climate change, but also of society's ability to deal with that through its adaptive capacity. And that's what these types of maps are showing. Right. Now, specifically, we know that's a very generic way of representing a societal level adaptation. But specifically, we know that farmers might do very, very specific things. They might change their sowing dates of their crops. They might change crop varieties to drought-tolerant varieties, for example. They may introduce irrigation where it wasn't before. They might change land use. Okay? So if you are growing a particular crop and you're losing the capacity to grow that crop into the future, you're not going to carry on growing that crop. You're going to grow a different crop that's better suited. That's fairly obvious. So we have to think in these terms. So just looking purely at crop yields is not a way of understanding climate change impacts. We have to understand how the whole system is going to respond, and particularly those human responses. So that's what farmers can do. However, I want to show you another example, which has many parallels, but some fundamental differences. And I want to show you some messages on this as well. It also happens to be, for those who know me, one of my favourite subjects, wine. I would normally be sort of thinking about a glass of wine by now to go with supper, but there we are. So I'll talk about wine instead. So wine is really interesting as a sector because it's really, really sensitive to climate change, really sensitive for a number of reasons. And in fact, when we produced the European chapter for the fifth assessment report, we introduced wine as one of the major sectors that we analysed and reported on. And actually, we've reported it within a box. So I'm pleased to say I've managed to introduce a wine box into our chapter, although it didn't have a little plastic spout at the bottom, unfortunately. But anyway, you can go and have a look at the wine box if you want to, if you're interested in this subject. But anyway, just a little bit of data. I'm going to focus this. This is actually taken from a Greenpeace report, so I'll put my hand up about that now, but actually it was based on research undertaken in a French research institute. A couple of sort of background pieces of information about wine production. We're going to focus on Burgundy, because it's a really interesting example. And I'll come back to why in a moment. But one of the things that's also interesting about the wine sector is that they've been monitoring climate over often centuries almost, because there's a real incentive to understand climatic variability because of the sensitivity of the notion of a vintage wine, a wine that's better in one year compared to another, is all to do with climate or weather variability. So they've been monitoring that. So actually you can actually begin to see already a signal of climate change in some of the monitoring sites. So this is Macon and Dijon in Burgundy. You can begin to see some of these signals coming through. But also particularly, so I realise there's a lot on here, some of the sort of detailed phenology of grapes is also observable at the moment. So this is things like you've got maturity at harvest. These give dates. So this is the timing. So as this decreases, it means that harvest is coming earlier because the grapes are maturing earlier because there's warmer temperatures. Ripening happens earlier. Flowering happens earlier. Bud break happens earlier. So all of these phenological stages are just shifting forward. So they're observing that already. So the wine sector is really sensitive to these things. And things like, okay, what's this? This is the weight of bunches of grapes for 2 grape varieties. These are the 2 key ones in Burgundy. You know all about Burgundian wines, don't you? You don't need a wine primer for this. Yeah, okay, that's good. So Pinot Noir for red and Chardonnay for white. Those are the 2 classic, almost spiritual homes of those 2 grapes, and they make fantastic wines. But you can see again, there are trends in what's going on. These are different locations within Burgundy. So things are happening. And the people producing wines know that things are happening in this sector. Now, again, sorry, it's not very good quality, but you don't have to see the detail on this, just feel the colours, all right? And I'll explain to you what it means. This is like, do you remember hairy greenweed? Does that mean anything to you? Second slide today. Hairy greenweed. Okay, so this is a little bit like hairy greenweed for wine production. So it's looking at climatic zones and how they would change. So this is more or less the current distribution of climatic zones. And these are just defined in terms of simple temperature thresholds of annual temperature. But what you could see, and it's fairly typical if you know something about the wines of France, you've got like a Mediterranean zone. It's very much, Provençal wines and the Languedoc. You've got the sort of intermediate climate wines. You've got, by the way, the white areas indicate the location of vineyards. So you've got Bordeaux, and you've got the bottom part of Burgundy here. You'll see the Burgundy is actually on that threshold. And then you've got the cool climate zone of wine production. So you'll have the Loire Valley here, you've got Champagne up here and Alsace along here. All right? And they're quite different. And the major difference, if you know, is that they grow very different grape varieties in those different locations. Over years of experimentation and practicing, that's what happens. So this gives a very wild, high-end scenario of climate change for the year 2100. Right? You don't have to understand what it's about. It's just a big shift in the climate. And what you see, obviously, is it's the same colours as here. These zones shift up. So what was the Mediterranean zone, or the zone of temperature around the Mediterranean, shifts up to encompass the Loire, Champagne, and Alsace. Right? And these arrows, I think, means that it's going over the channel, okay, but they don't actually mention that. So things are changing. So you've got a completely different distribution of climates in these different zones. And that is really significant because you may be familiar with the French concept of terroir, which is the notion of the interaction between the landscape, the soil, the climate, the culture of winemaking, which is actually sounds very romantic, but it was actually a marketing trick developed by the Burgundians in the 1930s. And it's been very, very successful because everyone thinks it's now centuries old, this tradition. But it is really important to the ethos of producing wine in a lot of places. So in Burgundy, they produce Pinot Noir, which is a cool climate grape. So if we want to adapt to climate change, what do? It's easy, yeah? So the farmers, they just change crop variety. So the Burgundians just do exactly the same, yeah? So instead of growing Pinot Noir, they grow Syrah instead, because Syrah is a hot climate grape grown in the Mediterranean. Makes complete sense, yeah? Easy, problem solved. We'll just have more Syrah from Burgundy. But, big problem. The big problem is the Burgundians can get hundreds of euros for a bottle of Pinot Noir wine because of the centuries of tradition that are behind it. Thousands of euros in some cases, right? So, and that's based on this notion of terroir, that we have been doing this for centuries and we're fantastic, this is how it is. Okay, you're not going to have Pinot Noir anymore, we're going to have Syrah in your bottle, right? So you're going to spend hundreds of euros for Burgundian Syrah. It has no tradition, it's never been grown before. And what I want is Burgundian Pinot Noir, this sort of Syrah stuff. So what's going to happen to, what are the economic consequences of wine production in these types of areas? Could be absolutely dramatic. So the point about this is that our sense of how we adapt to issues like climate change is not just about the physical and the technical. We can change crop yields, we change varieties, because we're actually embedded within the sort of social constructs of what it is we're consuming from the natural world. And in this case, our perception of what's in a bottle can be equally as important in determining how you may adapt to climate change. Very interesting. Some of the winemakers in France are actually experimenting with introducing new varieties, so maybe they're going to have to find a clever way of remarketing themselves. But that will be part of the adaptation strategy, not just a technical innovation. It's how they deal with the marketing. Right, a bit closer to home. Another message here, trade-offs. Okay, thank you, Andy. I don't know if you're in the audience for this data, Andy Kerr, UCCI. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Climate Change Scotland Act, which has set Scotland's emissions targets. So this is where we are currently in terms of these numbers, and these are the targets of CO2 equivalents in 2020 and 2050. So that's what's got to be achieved. In terms of 2006, this is where we are at the moment. Rural land use, transport, waste, heat, other aviation, traded sector and woodland, which is negative. And that's the contributions to Scotland's greenhouse, to Scotland's carbon balance. So there's a lot of discussion about how can we implement those types of targets. And one of the things that's been highlighted, if you look at the positive effects of woodland in sequestering carbon, is we can start reforesting Scotland. And there's a lot of discussion through the land use strategy in Scotland about reforestation targets, even up to about 25% of the area of Scotland. So pretty substantial stuff. That'd be great. Lots more trees. Everyone likes trees. We all have one to hug and whatever. Great. Win-win situation, no problems. But what is the potential for increasing forest in Scotland? And we've run a number of analyses looking at different scenarios, different climates, different socio-economic contexts, and how would you actually achieve that target of increasing reforestation for climate mitigation and other purposes. Okay, under medium climate change up to 2050 is possible, but you have to increase food imports, okay, because you're taking agricultural land out of production by planting trees there. So if you're not producing as much food, then you have to import food. Okay, that doesn't sound so good. Society has to reduce meat consumption, again, because a lot of the agricultural production in Scotland is livestock-based. If you're taking land out for reforestation, less livestock, you either import it, or society can also respond by dietary changes. It may not necessarily be a bad thing. Or you have to intensify, right? So you add more nitrogen, more agrochemicals, okay? I'm not sort of building a very positive picture here, am I? I like trees, but... Or you forget about growing biomass crops, because you just don't have enough land. So basically, what we're faced with are sets of trade-offs. We might have lofty goals and ambitions in terms of climate mitigation, and reforestation is a great way of doing it. There's other reasons to do it as well, can have other benefits. But we have to accept that we've got to trade off with other things that may be less palatable to us. I don't think anyone would necessarily argue for increasing food imports, especially people involved in the climate change mitigation debate. There are issues, and we haven't fully resolved how we can find solutions to some of these types of problems. Trade-offs are needed to make land available. Okay, and here is Scotland, and this is just to give you an idea of what some of those trade-offs look like. So some of these maps aren't coming out too well, but this is a study, thank you James, we did looking at modelling, this is the increase in forest area actually, and what it would look like under a range of different scenarios. These are different scenarios than the ones I've been showing you earlier. They were developed by what's called the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. And you can more or less see what some of them are. So the world market scenario is a globalized world, so it would be a scenario where you would have big food imports because you're just trading commodities like food globally. And that means actually, if you look at this one, you get more forest than you do in a world called national security, where you're actually concerned about producing, being self-sufficient in the land-based projects you products you produce. So you want to produce your own food. If you want to produce your own food, you've got no land for forestry. Okay? So it's those types of trade-offs. A green and pleasant land, again, it's all about sort of managing the environment for aesthetic reasons, cultural heritage reasons, and aesthetic beauty. But again, it means that you can have more trees, and you can have many other ecosystems and increase biodiversity, but again, at the expense where you are effectively offsetting your demand for commodities like food to other parts of the world. So it has downsides in other places. So we have those teleconnections. Right, I'm going to skip that one. Here we are, right. There he is, Bertrand Russell, man with a pipe. I just want to come back to some of these questions of uncertainty. So at the moment, I guess I'm painting what might seem like a fairly gloomy picture in terms of there's lots of these really complex, difficult things that we need to grapple with. But that's just the way it is. So Bertrand said, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. Okay, very nice. It's a really nice quote. But actually what it really is saying, what it says to me anyway at least, is that we can accept the fact that there are doubts. It doesn't, if you are certain about something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you really know what's going on. Doubts and uncertainty are an inherent component of the complex systems that are the worlds and environments that we inhabit. So we have to accept that. We have to go with it, work with it. Okay? We can think about understanding it, and that's some of the things we've been trying to do. Okay, this looks a bit technical, but don't worry about this too much. So what we can start to do, we did a study looking at, okay, so we know that there's multiple drivers, multiple sectors, interaction effects, and all sorts of these things. Okay, let's just try and break it down. Can we start to explore the uncertainties associated with some of those issues? So we might look at a single input parameter to a model that's important. So this is one I mentioned earlier. So if you look at how society changes its preference for diets. So let's say if you go negative, society reduces beef and lamb consumption. Positive, it increases beef and lamb. Right? That could be important in terms of some of these issues. But rather than saying we think that's our best guess for a future scenario, we could try to explore what are the uncertainties associated around that central estimate. Right? In a future world, is there an upper and a lower limit? Okay, it might be about here and here. And can we think, well, that seems a little bit less likely than something which is a bit closer to our best guess estimate. So we can create some form of distribution, right? Called probability density function. And we could use that distribution rather than a single value as an input to the model. And you do lots and lots of number crunching, lots of simulations by sampling across that, and we'll get into technical details. So that what you can then do is produce PDFs or distributions of outputs. Okay, and I'll just take you through what some of these mean. And thank you, Callum, but your name's just dropped off the bottom. I saw in the audience. You were listed here. Okay, so what have we got here? So let's look at different, this is a nice easy one to understand. Food per capita, all right? This is for Europe, the whole of Europe. Each of these four curves you see on the legend, for each of these indicators, is actually based on a set of participatory developed stakeholder-led scenarios, okay, which are there. I mean, I won't go into the detail. Just take it from me, there are 4 different scenarios, and they're great. So food per capita. Well, actually, what you start to see, if you look at the median of those points, that would be what you would do if you just ran a simulation with a single value, your best guesstimate. But the ranges actually are really overlapping for that particular indicator. That's actually really interesting. So it means that even with different scenarios with completely different assumptions, different climate change, so we're sampling across the whole range of climate change scenarios and climate sensitivities and different models of the climate system. When you do all of that, for this indicator, actually you've got quite a small range of outcomes. And that's really significant for us, because what seems to be happening with some of these indicators is you get a convergence in the future that we weren't expecting. We thought that as you increase the complexity and increase the uncertainties, they would proliferate, they would propagate through the system, and you get complete convergence in alternate future worlds. And we're not finding that. So actually, things are not so bad in terms of how our capacity to understand these types of issues. So that's really interesting. And you see here, so the water exploitation index I showed you earlier. And again, the scenarios, these are really, really different worlds, really different climates, but they're beginning to agree. There seems to be compensatory mechanisms in the systems we're studying. There are a few notable examples. I haven't quite worked out what happened here, but that's something to study and investigate. There's a few interesting distributions. So this is a biodiversity index, a range of different species. And actually what you see is you get this bimodal distributions, which are probably something to do with land use shifts, but we're still trying to unpick what's actually going on there. But this one is really interesting. Have you seen this? So people flooded by a 1 in 100 year event. There's a number of people who were flooded under these different range of scenarios. And what you could probably see is the 4 scenarios of socioeconomics follow is a trimodal distribution. And it's really easy to explain because this simply in the model is different levels of flood protection. Simple as that, right? But what it shows is that the level, because you have these big steps, the level of flood protection, i.e. the adaptation to the problem of flooding, is much more important than the differences between different future scenarios, different future worlds. So that gives us something to hold on to. It means that we do have options and ways of managing these very difficult systems. Okay, I won't go on to that one. Right, okay, I've got 5-10 minutes left, I think, Sandy, don't I? Yeah. Something like that. Right, so I'd start off by saying the bit about adaptation, that this is how people have tended to do it in research communities. But this is what I would call, very much a top-down indicator-based approach. And it's got lots of problems with doing that. It's very broad brush. It sort of has problems. It's all very statistical, and we can never be really sure that our statistical functions, which we develop, calibrate for today, are going to hold into the future. So we've got all this. So it's really just not process-based. There's a whole set of emerging ways of thinking about adaptation that starts to put people back into it as a decision process. Adaptation is something that people will do. Right? They will either respond to a problem or they will anticipate a problem and put in place measures that will plan to avoid that problem. So we need to do something here about how we can improve our understanding of how people make decisions about adaptation. And in many ways, this is quite a new way of thinking. It seems sort of logical when I write it down like this, but it's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to understand how individuals make decisions about things and how we can simulate that in our future virtual worlds. So one way we could do that, and Peter's in the audience, thank you, Peter, for this graphic, is to do this type of thing. This is what's called a agent-based model. I won't go into the details, but what it's doing, I'll tell you what's going on here, and then just try to explain to you what it's trying to show. So what you see is an animation of a simulation, and it's actually the distribution of bioenergy crops. So it's actually a sort of climate mitigation issue, but it's indicative, representative of a decision process where somebody makes an adaptive decision. In this case, it's a farmer. So farmers are given subsidies to produce bioenergy crops. Therefore, they have to decide whether they will or they won't grow bioenergy crops. The other thing you can probably see is these little red dots. That's the location of power plants. So if you grow a bioenergy crop, such as short rotation coppicing, sort of willows, pollard, or if you produce miscanthus, elephant grass, you need somewhere where you actually burn the biomass and generate heat and electricity. So there's a co-evolution that goes on here. Right? So farmers are thinking, okay, this may be profitable to grow this crop, but there needs to be an outlet for that. Right? So you've got this co-evolution, which is what that simulation is showing. So you get a diffusion effect. You get an expansion of the growth. Oops, I'll just run that again. As you can see it now, you see that you get a few core kernel areas that you get expansion of the production of those crops. So the yellows, you see the legend shows the percentage area of those crops being grown from those initial kernel areas. And it's largely based on a diffusion. That's pure simulation. But actually, what we know is there are parallels in reality. So this actually goes back to, thankfully there's some of you in the audience who are old enough to remember this, like me, the introduction of oilseed rape into the UK. Do you remember? So it's basically in the early 1980s, the European Commission introduced a new subsidy for oilseed rape. It suddenly became known as black gold, and suddenly the landscape was full of yellow flowers, right, which you probably take for granted now, over at the UK. Apologies for the decapitated map on the left here. I'm not quite sure what went wrong with that. But there was no oilseed rape in Scotland at that time. But what you can see is, again, what this shows, although it's actually a different geographic location, it's the east rather than the west, because that's a different crop type, you get this spatial diffusion process that is emerging out, which we could see in this typical shape curve of the observations through time. So we know that there are parallels in practice, and we can actually then do this type of experiment where we rebase these simulations of the energy crop and overlay it on the observations of the oilseed rape crop to see what happens. And in this case, actually the curves match really well, even though they're completely different systems. One's simulated, one's observed. Now, what's significant about this, and this is the main point I'm trying to make, not saying that aren't we great, well, isn't Peter great for producing such a fantastic model that actually mimics reality? Well, it does show that we can produce models that mimic reality, which is useful. But the important point about this is you look at what's going on. This is the time horizon. So before you get a full uptake in both the empirical observed system and in the model system, it's up to about 20 years, right? Before you reach that peak. You get a very slow start, 5 years, nothing really doing. 10 years, not a lot, and then a big sort of exponential part of that curve where it takes off. Now, actually, for the British government who are trying to encourage farmers to grow bioenergy crops, that's actually not very good because they're anticipating, give them a subsidy, they'll all grow bioenergy crops. They're assuming that take up in year one. It just doesn't happen. So we're completely, potentially underestimating the capacity of individuals to respond to a given environmental or economic context. So there are really important time lags that happen in the decisional process. And that's going to be really significant in terms of climate change. So as we go into the future and people are responding to changing environments, what is the rate at which we're able to respond and put in place appropriate and necessary adaptation options? Can we keep pace with the rate of climate change? Much of this, in terms of the simulation modelling, and actually the reality as well, is to do with the exchange of knowledge between individual farmers about new farming practices. Right? So there may be ways in which we can stimulate that to allow farmers to better respond to the problems of climate change. Right, last couple of slides. This is nice and generic, and I'm not going to go into much details on this, but I just want to show you where a lot of this thinking is going in the research communities at the moment. So what increasingly we're doing, just like the example I showed you previously, is to think increasingly about how can we understand and how can we represent in models the decisional processes of individuals. We use, in my own team, a methodology called agent-based modelling, but there are other ways of doing this. And it's really just trying to understand what is the sort of human behaviour, attitude, underpin decision-making processes. Can we create generic functional types of the roles and behaviours of individuals, release them into a virtual world, okay, that we create in computer space, and use that to do simulations to see how those individuals will interact with one another, make decisions in response to climate change. We can't do experiments in the real world with real farmers in this case, but we can do experiments in computers. And we're increasingly starting to do that within some of the work, which I won't go into too much detail now. So again, what we're starting to shift here, what the difference is compared to what I showed you earlier, is again, okay, these are just two examples of simulating future land use change. But actually what we're beginning now to model in our simulations are the people and not the products. So most climate change impact will look at what is the crop production, okay? What is produced as a product is not thinking about the people who are producing that product or using a resource like water. So if we start thinking about people and what people are doing, then we can get a much better understanding, clearer insight into the consequences of decisions that people make in terms of production of crops, in terms of use of water resources, in terms of consumption of energy. So that's where we're trying to move. Okay, so final conclusions. Again, just to reiterate this point, being a little bit repetitious, but I think it's important, the need for impact assessment based on multiple drivers, multiple sectors, and also multiple spatial and temporal scales, which I didn't talk a lot about, but there are differences there, and their interactions. Okay, so that's where we need to be thinking, rather than the single climate change assessments alone. Exploration of the trade-offs that occur when adapting or when mitigating the problem of climate change is crucial, and there are not necessarily always win-win situations. There may be times when, if you want to mitigate, that has a bad effect in terms of your capacity to adapt. So we need to be able to understand that so we can better manage those conflicts. I think it's crucial that we start thinking about putting people back into understanding adaptation as a process or sets of processes. So looking at human-mediated processes and how we represent those in virtual worlds and do simulations. And some examples of that I've tried to show you are things like perceptions of impacts, the wine example, or time lags in decision-making and how that relates to time lags of climate change. So, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to try and answer them.
In the last slide, you said that the use of timber would increase quite a lot. That surprised me slightly. Was that for building houses, or what was it for?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's basically, I wouldn't read too much in that. It's one particular simulation, and there were assumptions about increases in timber demand. That could be globally. It could also be for bioenergy production, but that was one particular scenario. Don't know if you want to add anything to that, Callum. You did the simulation.
No, it's an assumption.
Yeah, it's an assumption. Yeah, so we're not actually saying that that is what will happen. It's one assumption, one scenario to explore. I think the point about that graph again, though, is that so what the curves show here are different, what we call agent types. So these are the people who are the land managers, the land users, and again, what you can see are very different trends in the different groups. So that's what we're interested in understanding. It's that again the competition effectively process between different users of land resources and how these alternative scenarios would play out in terms of their choices.
In an earlier lecture in this Our Changing World series, I think they covered behavioral economics or some such subject as that. And when you come to looking at the people in the system, is there crossover with disciplines like that and psychology to feed in the human input into these models?
Yeah, absolutely. I was interested you asked that question. I was discussing that very point with a colleague this morning in terms of what is the discipline of adaptation studies. What is it actually? And it's cross-disciplinary, for one thing. And there are clearly going to be, there's a need, and I think in a way that's probably why there's only been limited development in terms of looking at the process of adaptation rather than the representation with indicators of adaptation. There's clearly a role for economists at some level, probably behavioral economists out of the different types of economists. There's clearly a role for psychologists, sociologists, geographers, agronomists, depending on the system you're studying. And you know, it's bringing those people together which helps you actually make some progress in terms of building better modelled representation. And you need computer scientists to build code, to build models. So I think, yeah, the answer is all of those. Maybe there'll be a new discipline called adaptation science or something at some stage, which is a combination of those things. But we find this all the time with a lot of this type of work is very, very multidisciplinary. And you just can't do it as a standalone discipline, which I think is why, yeah, I actually never, when somebody asks me, what is your discipline, what's your background, I've got no idea how to describe that. And I'm quite happy with that because you're trying to reach across these different ideas. Because I think if you want to solve these problems, the complex problems, then you do need to have those multidisciplinary perspectives. There's no other way of doing it. Thanks. Please.
Your focus is primarily on Europe. To what extent are you considering the global implication? Because to take forestry, for example, globally, as I understand it, forestry is being reduced all the time and contributing to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. A recently published research project, I think it was in America, said that globally the population is likely to, world population is likely to hit 10 billion by 2100. To what extent are you taking into account the global factors impacting on climate change and what society generally has to do about it and take accountability?
Very, very good point. I alluded to that a little bit, but I wasn't explicit. I know. We do work with global scale models as well, and for exactly that reason, because no nation is an island. Well, I don't mean metaphorically. No nation is an island. We're all living in an interconnected, teleconnected world, and there are lots of relationships in many ways. Commodity supply chains are one thing, information exchange is another thing. One of the crucial factors where I did allude to that a little bit is in what we term, the various terms for it. One is displacement, the other is indirect effects or indirect land use change is a term that's used, which is, say, the example I gave of if you're doing something in your own territory, which means that you have to import more food, actually all you're doing is displacing the problem somewhere else in all sorts of different ways. They may be ecological impacts, could be climate system impacts. So if you're importing more food and somebody goes and chops down a bit of tropical rainforest to grow it, then you've made things worse in terms of the climate system and also in terms of the ecology and biodiversity of those areas. So you're just displacing your problem. So it's absolutely crucial. I totally agree with the sentiment of what you're putting forward, that we do need to consider those interconnected effects across the globe, because there's no point Scotland producing a green and pleasant land with lots of attractive landscapes if actually that's just destroying another ecosystem in some other part of the world. Morally, it's not defensible.
So you started your talk with the UNEP report showing that we're not on track for meeting the 2 degrees Celsius target, and that we're heading way beyond that. I've often heard it said that a 4 degrees world is beyond adaptation. John Schellenhuber, for example, has said that the difference between a 2 and a 4 degrees future is human civilization or some such. So I was just wondering what your view of the limits to adaptation are, and can we say anything about those now?
Yeah, can I answer that in about 4 years' time? We just got a new European Commission funded project looking at exactly that, high-end scenarios of climate change, so the 4 to even 6 degrees, and looking at the limits to adaptation. That's an explicit objective. I think at the moment nobody really knows. I'm sure John Schellenhuber has an opinion on most things, and he's a very clever man, and maybe he does know. But I think it's, again, we're going to need to go beyond just the climatology in trying to understand those types of issues. And we do need to be incredibly imaginative in thinking about what the world is going to look like in 50 to 80 years' time. So those type of high levels of climate change are really sort of towards the end of this century, when you have any chance of actually getting there. But the world is going to be so different. If you just try and imagine what the world was like 70 or 80 years ago, it's quite a bit different than it is now. And the rate of development and change, well, maybe in the Western world, is very, very rapid, and that will continue to change into the future for certain. We just don't know how that's going to happen and what the consequences of that will be. Now, I'm not trying to say, as some people might argue, that we don't bother about any of the problems now because in 50, 60, 70, 80 years' time we'll have all the answers through technology. I think that's obviously a very dangerous thing to do. But I think as an academic trying to understand what might happen, I think it's important that we try to address those types of changes and don't ignore it, because they could be significant, or they will be significant.
So yeah, you mentioned a lot of drivers, indicators, causes, huge amounts of different interacting models and all that kind of stuff. Would you say that there are any single couple of surefire ways, strategies, adaptations that one could use for basically that would work cross-model, that one could use to mitigate climate change, basically?
I didn't show this one, but thank you for the cue. There are things we could do. Actually, this was a study that was looking at adaptation, mitigation, and these are options for adaptation, options for mitigation, and it was looking at biodiversity, so effects of those options on biodiversity. It's a slightly confusing diagram, but the idea is to try and explore, as you can get from the language here, the sort of win-win-win, where you have benefits to adaptation, benefits to mitigation, and benefits to biodiversity. And of course, there are also lots of losers in here as well. So there's some things, I mean, and these are very specific management options that you could implement. So for example, an example of this where you've got desalination is very good for adaptation if you're short of water, but it's very bad, very negative for mitigation because you're using lots of energy to desalinate water. But some of the ones in the middle, this is more the sort of win-win-win territory. You've got things like urban tree planting, green rooftops, irrigation doesn't look too bad, forest conservation, forest pest control. So there are things there that are actually beneficial to mitigation. So forest growth would increase, you would increase more carbon, but it's also good for the forest in terms of biodiversity or ecological quality, and it makes them more resilient to adapting to climate change. So we could start looking at some of those, but it's quite difficult. This study was done, I don't know if you get a sense of this, there's the sort of central bars here, and then these are error bars. And it was based on, I mean, it's qualitative, but it was based on a literature review. So there's some attempt to look at the magnitude of those ranges. And some of them are quite big, actually. So it also depends on the context and the specific option which has been implemented where.
It's been said that one of the ways in which human beings will adapt, one of the major ways in which human beings will adapt to climate change will be in terms of migratory movements. And I wondered if any of your work had looked at that and the impact of that. and if there were any particular hotspots. A lot of your work appears to be looking at future scenarios, but I wondered whether you were aware of what was actually happening currently in terms of these kind of migratory patterns due to climate change.
It's not really my field, but that won't stop me giving an opinion. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concern about that. And if you just think about it logically and obviously, places which are more vulnerable to climate change, meaning you'll have a large climate change impact and you have a low ability to cope with that impact or adapt to that impact, are likely to be the hotspots where societies are more likely to want to shift to some other less vulnerable location. That again would take some sort of global comparative exercise, because the notion of a hotspot is also relative to cold spots and intermediate spots or whatever, so it's all relative. And in many cases it's not the areas that are best able to adapt or cope with climate change which are going to be the places where people are going to migrate out of. So I think you can sort of work out parts of the world where there are likely to be hotspots. The magnitude of that effect, again, there'd be better qualified people than myself to comment on that, but it's difficult to tell. I've seen quite alarmist reports in terms of mass migration globally, and can we cope with that, to other more conservative perspectives which suggest, well, actually, there are other reasons why people don't migrate. It's not just because the climate's changing, and there's people migrate for other reasons, and or they have ownership of local culture and property, which is a barrier to them migrating. So I think at the moment, I don't know, I can't give you a clear answer on that. I think there's probably a large difference of opinion. Potentially it could be very important in terms of changing social dynamics, which would also affect the ways in which those societies adapt to climate change.
On your model, which you had food per capita, was food per capita an output of the model, or was that an input in the model?
Yeah,
so
that was an output.
So the model says we're going to eat less on some scenarios, or we're going to eat more on some scenarios. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, or it's partly a function of the production capacity as well under certain scenarios. So if you really push things to the extreme, so we're sampling right across a whole range of different future scenarios. So you could have really extreme situations where food potentially becomes more scarce and more expensive, and people modify their diets accordingly.
Do you think that the certainty of the climate modeling work that's being done right now is a driver for people to actually think about adaptation and mitigation measures, especially at government levels? Because the response you tend to get a lot is, well, it's very uncertain, we don't have a high enough resolution, we don't know what we can do locally. So is that a driver of people's inclination to adapt and mitigate? And if so, is the precision of climate modeling moving at a fast enough pace to keep up?
Yeah, I think the two responses to that. It's a good point. I think it's very difficult for people to visualize what a climate change scenario looks like. So if we say 4 degrees warmer, what does that mean? We don't really know. We don't really quite understand. We can't internalize what the consequences of that might be for us as individuals. I'm sure policymakers are the same. So I think there's a little bit of a, we can't quite get our heads around the magnitude of the problem. I think that's one thing. In terms of the uncertainty of future climate projections, I actually, if I'm perfectly honest, I think obviously the global climate system is a complex system. It's inherently unpredictable. We will never have a prediction of any complex system into the future. But what the climate community has done is given us a fantastic spread of plausible future climates that we can work with. And I think personally that there should be, within climate change research, a shift from the focus on understanding the climate system better, because, okay, you're probably tweaking around the edges a little bit, and I'm sure climatologists would argue there's massive science problems that they could tackle. Look at any system, there are massive science problems you want to tackle. But actually, if we want to look at this from a societal perspective, we should be putting more resource, research-wise, into understanding the impacts and adaptation. And we've got a bandwidth, if you like, of future climate projections that allows us to operate within that space to understand what would be a potential bandwidth of impacts and adaptation. Okay, so I think that's the way things should be shifted. So we don't have to worry about the uncertainty. That's what I'm trying to have off the climate system. In fact, actually, I would argue that we know much more about the uncertainty of the climate system than we do about our own human systems. Actually, that's a personal opinion.
You mentioned the lag time inherent in the success of subsidies, and that's for taking up new methods and crops, etc. And the problem that causes for the short-term nature of politics. Do you see, presumably there are, like there is oilseed rape example, that was occurred before, and oilseed rape was successful in dominating our landscape. Do you see ways in which politics is able to get around that short-termism? Do you have hope despite that short-term nature?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, actually. So how could you overcome that problem of the time lag? Again, I'd probably have to speculate at this moment in time. And maybe it is a question of the level of subsidy that's provided, for example. So maybe there's a reticence to change something if you think it's only going to be a marginal gain. Whereas if you thought, oh, whoopee, this is the new gold mine, I'll plunge straight into that. Maybe that might be a factor. Certainly in this case, a lot of the time lags we're seeing is to do, well, some of it's maybe to do with risk aversion, but a lot of it's just to do with knowledge and awareness. So as a farmer, I come from a farming background, so I know how farmers think and behave to some extent. And they can be quite a conservative group of people at times. There's nothing wrong with that. They're having to operate within a very volatile business, so they have many skills to deal with that. But they're not going to take big risks if there's no obvious gain. And what we're finding as well is that there's a lot, certainly within farming communities, a lot of exchange, and there's been a lot of work done on this in the past, of knowledge and information between individual farmers, just from face-to-face contact at the local market or down the pub. And they quite often, again, we've done a lot of social survey work trying to explore some of these decision-making processes. And farmers very often simply make a decision on the basis of a chat at the market with some other farmer who's doing something else, or even there's evidence to suggest that they just imitate each other. They look over the hedge, what's he or she doing next door, and they do the same thing. And that's why you start to see those spatial diffusion patterns. So when you have the diffusion going out, there's no reason why the farmer up here who adopts 10, 15 years later than the farmer here, that the risk of producing that crop is any lower up here than it was down there. But it took a while for that knowledge to diffuse across the landscape through contact between individuals. So one thing we might be able to do is think about how we communicate adaptation strategies. So that will be awareness raising, giving people information that they can act on, that they would believe that's credible, and thinking of alternative mechanisms by which they can receive that information and act on it. Maybe you need more advisors who would advise farmers, for example. It may be that this could be a good example of where the as it were, the knowledge accruing process itself may be fundamentally changed by societal changes, including the internet and access to knowledge that is increasing all of the time. And maybe farmers will be part of that process. And in 50 years' time, you won't see 20-year time lags, you might see 5-year time lags. We just really don't know.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Mark. And so it's my pleasure then to offer a vote of thanks to Mark. And I think what Mark's done for us today is demonstrate conclusively that understanding the physical basis of climate change is only the very first step. And although that's complex enough, you could argue that it's actually the simplest step. So we know that climate's changing, we know the environments are changing. But if we're to be able to vision what our future worlds could look like and to vision how decision making at this point in time might help shape our future worlds, then we immediately have to consider a very broad range of factors. We'd have to draw on a whole range of disciplines. We'd have to draw on centuries of academic endeavor that ranges from policy analysis through physiology, climate science, social science, economics. And it's really only once you start to have that discussion that you will start to see the interactions. And I thought what was particularly exciting is Mark demonstrating that we're starting to develop tools that allow you to look at all these different aspects within a single frame, a single modeling frame, not pretending that these are entirely deterministic. They're not going to tell us exactly what the future is, but it's allowing you to explore some of the possibilities. And if you were to ask me, I see that as possibly one of the great challenges for academia as we're heading into the next decade or decades, is seeing the degree to which you could integrate human behavior from the individual to the societal level in with our models of the physical system to help explore that space of what ifs and where are we going. So I would like to thank Mark very much for opening our eyes to this and painting that almost encouraging picture of fine wines migrating north to Edinburgh.